Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher and this is Presidential Chronicles, a series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of John Tyler and the focus is opposition in the Senate. The year is 1827. Tyler's already spent almost half his life in the public service, both at the state level. He had been in Congress, now serving as the governor of Virginia, and another spot had opened up where the state legislature was thinking of sending him back to Washington as a U.S. senator. Tyler was actually already supporting the incumbent, John Randolph, to get another term in the position, but the legislature had another idea. When the vote came in, 115 to 110, Tyler won it. And so Tyler, March 1827, heading back to Washington to be a U.S. senator. Tyler's philosophy was about individual sovereignty, the community, the state. This was the focal point of government in the United States for John Tyler, not the federal government. In fact, his father, who he idolized, had voted against the Constitution at the Virginia Ratifying Convention because he thought it was too much centralized power. Tyler believed in a limited powers only were given from the states to the federal government via the Constitution. Anything more than what was specifically enumerated in that document needed to be opposed. Otherwise, you would have despotism and you would have loss of individual liberty. This was the governing philosophy of John Tyler, which is why he was such an oppositional person when he was in the federal government. There were a lot of moves to actually take on more power for the federal government that Tyler simply thought was anathema. John Quincy Adams is president of the United States at the time, and he had a forward-looking agenda with a very strong role with the federal government, one of the reasons why John Tyler was such a consistent no vote. One of these areas was in federally funded internal improvements, where the federal government would take tax dollars, oftentimes through the tariff, which was the most common way of raising funds, but it came from across the entire country, and they would use those dollars to potentially build roads, bridges, canals, other improvements, sometimes only in individual states that John Tyler felt was unconstitutional. There was nothing in the Constitution that actually specifically said Congress could do this, and he thought it was bad policy because it's putting way too much power in the hands of the federal government to make these kinds of decisions that he felt should be left up to the states. One such bill, the bill to expand the Cumberland Road, although in one state, in the state of Ohio, came across in Tyler's early tenure in the Senate. One of his first speeches he came out very strongly against. Tyler said more danger is to be apprehended to the state authorities by the exertion of the assumed power over roads and canals by the general government than from almost any other source. It holds out the tender of the strongest bribe, which can be offered to a people inhabiting a country yet in its infancy, and which invites the exertions of man to its improvement in almost every direction. A bribe too tempting, don't do it. And in fact, this was the case for, at the time, where Quincy Adams a lot of his agenda went down, Tyler in the majority here helping to lead the opposition against that agenda. The tariff we mentioned was the primary method that which funding to the federal government came in. And again, this was taxes on imports coming in from other countries was the principal source. And there was a strong debate at the time over two types of tariffs: revenue-only tariffs and protective tariffs. Revenue-only tariffs basically said that the Congress needs money to be able to fund the needs of the federal government, and so the tariff was the way to do that. But for revenue-only, in other words, cap those tariffs not a penny more than the federal government needed to actually do its business. Protective tariffs took that to another level, where there was a feeling in some parts of the country, particularly in the North, that felt that the United States was at a disadvantage internationally, and to try to help industries in the United States grow in this competitive world, that they would slap on tariffs to make it more expensive domestically to buy international goods and encourage more purchasing of domestic goods. John Tyler thought protective tariffs were, again, bad. First of all, again, he didn't think that was in the Constitution. Yes, they could raise taxes, but it should be for revenue only, just to meet the expenses of the government. And he felt it was bad policy, putting too much power, once again, into decision makers in the nation's capital, not to mention the fact that his southern part of the country tended to be disadvantaged when some of these tariffs were being passed. So, big tariff came in 1828, and it was a protective tariff, a high protective tariff. Tyler was strongly against. He said this system of protective tariffs elevates the money principle above the influence of moral and just political causes. It appeals to the motives of self-interest in place of those high and lofty motives which should alone control. In this case, he lost that debate. The Tariff of 1828 passed. It was later called, especially by the South, the Tariff of Abominations, and it caused Tyler a lot of angst. We'll talk about that more in our next episode. Well, the hot topic of the day really was the presidential election coming up there in 1828. This was going to be a rematch between the incumbent John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, who had beaten Adams in both the Electoral College and the popular vote 4 years before, but didn't get a majority in the Electoral College. It went to the House of Representatives, and that's where John Quincy Adams won and became president. It was bitter in 1824. It was even more bitter in 1828. So the question was, where did John Tyler stand? Well, he's never going to support Adams. Politically, they were completely at odds. He was going to be a reluctant supporter of Andrew Jackson. He said to General Jackson, "I haven't entertained the strongest objections. There are even now many, many others whom I would prefer, but every day that passes inspires me with a strong hope that his administration will be characterized by simplicity. I mean Republican simplicity." He was actually pretty aligned politically and ideologically, I should say, with Jackson in a number of areas, but they would have significant divides coming up, and again, we'll talk about that more in our next episode. Before Jackson could take office, Tyler had another duty to perform, and this was at a constitutional convention that was held in his home state of Virginia. It was kind of a who's who. Former presidents James Monroe, James Madison were both there, also the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, John Marshall, future President John Tyler, notables from all parts of the state. The reason they came together is there was this growing sense in the western part of Virginia that they were being disadvantaged by the current rules under which the state was operating, particularly around representation and the right to vote. A lot of this was influenced by the fact that Virginia adopted the federal standard of the 3/5 rule, so that slaves counted 3/5 of a person towards representation, not only at the federal level, but at the state level. And this was giving a big advantage to the elite plantation owners and the slaveholders in the eastern part of the state, different from the population in the west, which didn't have slaves, and they felt they were disadvantaged. They wanted population just based on white males to determine who actually could vote, to expand the suffrage along those lines, and to be able to get more representation or fairer representation in the state government. Well, they finally came together in a constitutional convention to fight this one out, and John Tyler was, maybe not surprisingly, given his background, coming from the slave-holding elite plantation owners of the East, he was decidedly against these reforms. They spent 3 months talking about them, but really nothing came from this. Most of the votes went down. Tyler was solid on the no side to the proposed reforms, against using only white males for the population basis for representation, against expanded suffrage, against the popular election of the governor. None of these things passed. Very little came from this constitutional convention other than perhaps further alienating the western population from the East. They would eventually break and create their own state about 30 years later. 1830 was also the time that the final child from John and Letitia Tyler came into the world. He's now 40 years old. Typical roles and responsibility in the family life. He earned the keep going outside of the home, whereas Letitia raised the family, ran the farm, and Tyler was very happy with his domestic situation, reflected in a letter that he sent to his 15-year-old daughter, Mary. We're talking about Mary's mother, his wife, Letitia. "I could not hold up to you a better pattern for your imitation than is constantly presented to you by your dear mother. You never see your course marked with precipitation, but on the contrary, everything is brought before the tribunal of her judgment, and her actions are all founded in prudence." Well, it's a good thing to be happy at home, because the oppositional John Tyler was often in major conflicts at work, and that was about to get worse. But that's the story for another day. That is John Tyler, Opposition in the Senate, from the life of John Tyler. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.